Greetings, fellow alchemists, and welcome to Wordplay Wizardry. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you enjoy this video or have any questions, leave a comment below. Well, I hope you're somewhere comfortable, because today we're going to take a deep dive into genre, an extended look at the first on the list, action adventure. Now, obviously, there's two parts to this genre, action and adventure. The action aspect should be fairly self-explanatory. Within the story, there's a lot of action. Fights, car chases, hand-to-hand combat, battles, duels, things of that nature. The adventure side involves a quest or a journey. In a lot of cases, people will separate the two, action fiction and adventure fiction. However, because of their similar elements, it's often easier to combine them. In this way, action-adventure becomes a modifier. It can blend with other genres. So you wind up with fantasy-adventure, sci-fi action, historical adventure, and frankly, dozens of others. With these blended subgenres, the only question you really need to ask is, which is more important? The other genre, or the action-adventure? Lord of the Rings is fantasy first, then adventure. But the reality is, it depends. Mostly on the other genre. Sometimes that other genre is just a backdrop, meaning that the story could translate to another genre. Now, action-adventure splits into its own subgenres. If you don't recall, a subgenre is a blending of two genres or a split within a genre. So in this case, a split from the main genre of action-adventure might be war. Some notable subgenres would be war, as I said, sea or pirate, spy, martial arts, disaster stories, crime or cop stories. Additionally, Kindle, and therefore Amazon, gives the option of LGBTQ plus action-adventure stories and women's adventure. Is it truly necessary to go that far? Not necessarily. In my opinion, which clearly carries a lot of weight being male, women's action-adventure seems to be just a typical action-adventure story with a female protagonist. Is that a good thing for selling? Yes. As a specific subgenre? Probably not. Simply because it's just female-driven, at least as far as I can tell. Most definitions say women's literature are stories that appeal to women more than men, be it the lead or the subject matter. So perhaps if the adventure is geared more towards women, it might be viable in that way. If it's just a female lead, less so. Why? Laura Croft. Sure, she's sexy, but she is a female adventurer. With the right lead and the right story, men will read something with a female protagonist. Now, I will say the LGBTQ plus subgenre might be more acceptable. But at the end of the day, splitting genres due to gender or orientation or race is not a true separation. Not in the same way separating war and thriller might be. Though let me just note here that I think female leads and LGBTQ plus stories are a good thing. Yes, I am an ally to all, and I think a diverse cast makes fiction better. But let's keep going. What are some of the elements of the genre? First and foremost is the pace. Action-adventure stories usually move on the faster side of storytelling. Because they involve action, danger, and or peril, there's an assumed faster pace, unless there's a decently present romantic subplot. But overall, action-adventure stories should move. But there's a caveat here. A true adventure story will move slower than a true action story. True adventure tales always have more slower moments. and slow moments are for exposition and page time for any subplots. You get a lot more of both with adventure than you do action. But back to my original point. The story itself should maintain a good, steady pace, increasing with every instance of action. This, especially for adventure tales, increases the tension in the background. When you describe that action, you need to do so with the same energy that you intend. If you've ever been around a child telling a story, you probably have some idea of what I mean. They can't get the words out fast enough. They get loud and boisterous, maybe even act out a few parts. They say when Peter Jackson was directing Lord of the Rings, he would do that, which means your goal should be writing your story to keep up that increased pace. Now, there's a few ways to get the story out in order to accomplish this before writing it down. The first is to speak it. If you've never really done this before, get something to record yourself and narrate. In order to understand the power and ferocity of the instance, you should hear it. So, tell it like a child might, which then leads to the second method, finding the words necessary to create that same energy. Which feels faster, got behind cover or dove behind cover? Dove behind cover, because that's an action that takes and implies energy. Now, you can find some of these words without speaking that story, which is why it's its own point. Another way is to visualize the story in your mind. This can be particularly helpful because having a quasi-visual reference can make it easier to describe. All you have to do is transcribe what you see in your mind, though this can be easier said than done for some people. But back to pace. Calm moments can be calm, but there also needs to be an underlying sense of tension. As I mentioned, that energy should never go away. Imagine it like a rubber band. Every calm moment stretches it just a little bit more. Stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch and stretch. And then the action hits, and boom, rubber band goes flying. Calm moments in an action story build that tension. They are what stretch that rubber band. From a scientific standpoint, calm moments and tension build potential energy. The release or actual action is kinetic energy. According to physics, the more stored potential energy means the more released kinetic energy. The more tension that you build, the more chaos it releases. Of course, literature has a variable that physics doesn't, and that is time. In the pace video, I mentioned the opening of Saving Private Ryan. The buildup of tension is about 2 minutes of screen time. The battle across the beach to the sand wall takes about 7 minutes. In terms of literary kinetic release, as with cinematic, there's 2 types, fast and slow. Fast happens all at once. Boom, everything unleashes. Slow is a release over a period of time. Now, you might think that when bullets start flying, it's a fast release. It's not. The best example of fast release is a jump scare. Something that happens suddenly. In the case of a jump scare, it deflates all of the tension, or most of the tension, very, very quickly, but it also leaves the audience vulnerable. As I said, a slow release is something like a fight, because it's not all at once. It's releasing all of that tension over time. If it was one hit, sure, but usually fights are lots of back and forth. All that stored energy released over a longer period. Let's get back to Saving Private Ryan. There's a break in the action when they reach the relative safety of the sand wall. The fight isn't over, but within their bubble, there's time to breathe, time to talk, time to regroup. If it was any other story, the majority of tension would leave. However, because it's a war story, there's still bullets flying, which means that even though we've released a lot of energy up until that point, we're still building it for what happens next. And it was able to sustain the fight over that longer period because of how hard the tension increased. What does that mean? So let's go back again to the very beginning. We hold on the sand and the waves for about 30 seconds. The next minute and 30 of screen time is soldiers preparing. We go from calm beach to men preparing themselves to not see home again. 4,400 men didn't leave the beach that day. And I'm sure on those landing craft, a lot of them didn't think they were leaving. But once we start focusing on that preparation, the tension begins to increase exponentially. You know what's coming, and the soldiers do too. Because of that increase in tension, we can sustain the action for longer. Now, there is a big release right when the doors of the landing craft open, right in that 10 seconds when the shooting starts. There's a big release, but then it keeps going and going and going. Unfortunately, that's what war does. But because the tension and the potential energy started so high, when the kinetic energy hits, it doesn't just immediately drop off. Now, if you've been building the tension up for a big climactic fight at the end, you don't have to make the fight proportional, the time of the fight proportional, or exponential, like Saving Private Ryan. It can be smaller, but if that's the case, it needs to be more intense. That is the key. Make the payoff worth the wait. Now let's turn our attention to the other elements. The first is action or fighting. We know that, but the setting and subgenre will dictate how that happens. If it's fantasy, you're looking at swords and axes and armor and siege weapons. If it's sci-fi, it'll be some sort of futuristic weapon. Lasers, blasters, spaceships, something. But that also depends on the type of sci-fi. If the story's set more historically, it'll be more like fantasy with medieval weaponry, at least up until the gunpowder age, and even into it, starting in the 1600s, but more specifically into the 1700s, we got the rise of the flintlock. Before then, cannons came onto the scene in the late 1200s. But it wasn't until the 1500s that gunpowder battles happened on a larger scale. So you'll need to know the age and the corresponding weaponry. As I mentioned, fantasy uses more medieval weaponry. So instead of cannons, you're talking catapults and trebuchets. For anything after World War II, we'll consider that modern, at least in terms of elements. Because by then, you had weapons and vehicles that we still use today. Tanks, cannons, guns, planes, and cars. Yes, the style is different, but a plane is a plane, car is a car, and a gun is a gun, regardless. Doesn't matter if the plane has a prop or a jet, it's still a plane. Cars today look different, but function relatively the same, except for hybrids and EVs. But those are still cars and use some form of motor. And we still use a version of the 1911 pistol to this day. Though, just like historical, all of these modern elements need to be in the right age or era. The M60 was first made in 1957, so putting one in D-Day doesn't really make a lot of sense. Which is where we get to the point I made in the overview video. Research will go a long way into getting these elements right. When things were available, who were they available to? Public or military? Also, functionality. Now, in film, functionality will usually go out the window for cinematic purposes, which is why characters don't usually reload at the necessary times. If you want a good example of this done right, might I suggest the 1985 film Clue? And you may be thinking, but why? And a movie based off of a board game? But the reason I bring it up is that the characters actually have an argument about how many bullets are left in the revolver. And that's based on how many shots have been fired up until that specific argument. Quiet House, they can all hear a gun go off. and several people counted. But did they count correctly? 1 plus 2 plus 1 plus 1. Go watch the film. Another good thing to know is geography and political landscapes. Countries have changed names and even borders several times over the years. So it's a good idea to know names and places and locations. Knowing local customs is good if you have a specific setting in mind. Now, granted, a lot of this is easier if you set it in your own country. It means a lot less research is required. You know the customs, you know the landscape, the layout, the distances, and the names. You can check and make sure, but for the most part, you have an idea. There will still be some research, just not as much. Now, this next one is a good question that a lot of people may ask. Should you, as an author, experience some of the things in your novel? In terms of locations, couldn't hurt. You can read about something and look at pictures, but it's not quite the same as standing there. But only do that if you can afford to go. No, really. Only do that if you can afford to go. Now, in terms of other elements, I will say maybe. You don't have to shoot a gun in order to include them in your novel. I put guns in my stories, and I've only shot 2 in my entire life. My grandfather's revolver and rifle, and mostly because they were my grandfather's. But what about swords? Should you enter a fencing class? Not necessarily, but maybe. If you want to, sure, by all means. If you want to hold a sword or an axe, have at it. It will help you understand. To be able to feel the weight, the movement, can do nothing but help you. But again, you don't have to. If your goal is purely knowledge, you can see videos on both subjects. You can see guns fired, hear the various sounds different calibers make, and see the various fighting styles with different bladed weapons. One good option, and not a sponsor, but if you want to understand bladed weaponry, is the show Forged in Fire. In it, blacksmiths make modern and historical weapons, and the experts discuss various elements such as balance, weight, and grip. You can watch a swordmaster swing them in semi-realistic conditions, how a soldier might fight, what might happen if the blade misses its target. The show is good not only for the blade aspect, but for the blacksmithing aspect as well, the forging aspect. Granted, they didn't have modern gas forges historically, but the practice of moving metal hasn't changed much. The only difference is the inclusion of a mechanized hammer to take the brunt of the work. Beyond that, fire, hammer, anvil hasn't changed much in thousands of years. I suppose the other big difference with the show is the timeline. The first challenge is always just a few hours to finish a blade, usually dagger-sized. Historically, this might take days or weeks, or if it was particularly high quality, months. But this shortened time frame is only possible thanks to the modern inventions. Now with science fiction, the difference is more of a twist than a change. There might still be soldiers, might still be formations, but maybe the weapons are just different. Spaceships instead of standard tanks, but both can be weaponized vehicles. If it's a more grounded sci-fi, then likely just the weapons will be different. Maybe it's technology we're on the verge of creating, but haven't yet. In the 1980s, during the Cold War, the superpowers dipped their toes into sci-fi. High-energy lasers, missile interceptors, kinetic bombardment. And I included several of these projects in my novel, MK Ultra. Now, as a point of clarity, the government got none of it to work on a large scale, sometimes not even on a small scale. But that didn't stop me from speculating within the story. Perhaps publicly it didn't work, but maybe privately they finished those projects. Maybe they actually did work, and we just don't know. If you'd like, you can look up the Strategic Defense Initiative for the American side of things. See what we tried to make happen. So if you wanted to extrapolate based on some of that original work, you could. One thing I will bring up is coil guns. These haven't seen widespread use, but they are becoming much more of a reality. They don't rely on explosives to propel a projectile, instead use magnets to do so. How widespread are they? People are building them and putting the videos on YouTube. But no matter the setting, research will do wonders. Now there is one thing to keep in mind. I personally don't like using products or specific names. I fear a lawsuit. Is it likely? Only marginally, but that doesn't mean I like it. Now, if you don't paint that product in a bad light, the odds go way down, but it's still entirely possible. So, for something like weapons, I tend to go with the weapon type. Pistol, rifle, shotgun, etc. And it's modified by the caliber. 45 caliber, 9mm, and the like. When I write a story set in the real world, the exact weapon isn't as important. Knowing aspects of the guns matters more. For example, knowing the average magazine size for a 45 caliber semi-automatic rifle. And it's the same thing with cars. I don't need to mention Ford or BMW, just like I don't need to mention Colt or Remington. I don't need to know who made the tires of the vehicle. I just need to know its capabilities. I need to know its style. I need to know its engine, its cab, that sort of thing. One reason you can get away with this is a lot of cars use the same frame or platform. So they may not look exactly alike, but they look similar and handle similarly, which means what you need to know more is number of doors, engine size, top speed, and overall shape. Again, unless something specific is needed. Of course, you could take another approach. Contact the company in question, say Colt for firearms or Ford for vehicles. Tell them you're an author and you want to find out about the legality of using one of their vehicles in your story. They may have conditions for that use, or they may just say go ahead. However, it's probably easier to just go with something generic. A 4-door sports car with a high-end motor. A 5.56 semi-auto rifle with pick rails. Sometimes you don't even need to be detailed. High-caliber rifle. Sports car. The point is, the focus needs to be on the story and not just the items appearing in it. They serve a purpose to service the story, which means don't worry about describing every aspect. Just tell your tale. But then again, if it's historical, you want to make sure the right item is in the right hands. Actually, you want that for modern day as well. Another thing to focus on is characters. Sidekicks make the protagonist better, just as the reverse is true. Heroes need to be flawed enough that by the time they overcome, they can win. And at least one of the main characters needs to be relatable. If the reader or audience can't put themselves in the shoes of the main character, then they should be able to do so with someone near the main character. We call this the everyman. Someone to ask the questions the audience wants answered. Someone on the outside of things. The everyman is usually someone who steps out of their world and into another. Some call this part the fish out of water, but rarely is an everyman well-versed. They're an everyman. They're average. In Journey Beyond, Simon starts as an everyman. In Oddity Academy, Katie starts as an everyman. And yes, in both cases, they were fish out of water. But that really only applies to when it's a main character. If it's a side character, they're usually not. But Simon isn't a warrior or a soldier, and yet he's given a warship. He's a painter by trade, an artist. His family doesn't like the war. He wants to save lives instead of take them. Simon can identify as an everyman because of the fact that he's plucked out of an average life. Granted, that's a life where he's made a name for himself, is fairly famous, and has done well as an artist, and has great talent. But still, by comparison, it's an average life. He's just on Earth. His reaction to things out in space, on the spaceship, on space stations, is more of what an average person's reaction might be. Katie in Oddity Academy is much the same way. Separated from that world in the beginning, her reactions are what an average person's might be. Even the proactive stance of saving and protecting her friends is an everyman trait. Besides, If you made close friends very quickly when you had none before, wouldn't you be protective? I wanted to use these two examples because I want to illustrate that an everyman is not a sexist term. It isn't bound to one gender. What matters more is the audience can identify with or understand that person and their position. And no, there's nothing wrong with identifying with a character of another gender. This is about their thoughts and feelings and attitudes, and less about the other aspects. I don't identify with a female character who likes to shop, but I do identify with one that has a similar worldview to me. Good action-adventure characters are well-rounded, flawed, and relatable. Many of them may just be ordinary people in extraordinary situations, and they need their flaws. They need something internal to overcome as they overcome the external. So good becomes better, or good becomes great. And villains need to do the same thing, just in reverse. Bad becomes worse. Think of Belloc in Raiders of the Lost Ark. He's bad when he gets the natives on his side, but so much worse once he's working with the Nazis. Doing so allows him to dip into the worst parts of himself. With Belloc, it's only with Marion that his humanity shines through. And even then, when choosing between her and power, he chooses power. Bad to worse. And maybe that transition makes the bad guy unbeatable. Or maybe it makes their downfall extremely satisfying. That's up to you and the story. In terms of story structure, action-adventure is where the cliff model becomes much more apparent. The final resolution is often short. After the inciting incident, the entire story is leading to the climax, which doesn't leave a lot of room for the ending, for the resolution. But then again, it doesn't have to be all that involved. Remember, an action story is all about action. So if the action is over, you can wrap up the story fairly quickly and easily. Let's go back to Raiders of the Lost Ark. After the Nazis open the Ark and it kills everyone, Indy and Marion have a moment. Then they look at the Ark and we see the emptiness. And then we cut to DC for the wrap-up, which lasts less than 2 minutes. But at that point, the story's over. The Nazis are defeated, at least in this encounter, and the Ark is safe. What more do we need? Other genres may rely more on the bell curve, but action, specifically, and to some degree adventure, relies a lot more on the cliff model. Start low and slow, and then we start our climb. There's action, moving the pace along, and the tension builds over time until the big final moment atop the hill, a culmination of all the action and complication and tension that preceded. Now, this has been a fairly long video, which may make you think that the task of writing an action-adventure story is a daunting one, but it doesn't have to be. The biggest thing to remember is pace. A decently quick pace, punctuated by calmer moments that allow tension to build. Good, strong action that adds a touch of chaos. Well-rounded, relatable, believable characters that have a healthy amount of flaws. A bad guy who is relatable, but for some reason is irredeemable, and who gets worse the more power they acquire. These are a lot of the necessary elements for action-adventure. And even though it's in the name of the genre, it's not always about action. It's also a look into the human condition. I've mentioned the bad guy going from bad to worse, and the hero overcoming flaws and hardships several times now. And these two figures exemplify my point. Give two people power and see what happens. The good guy will often rise to the top, become better. An example of what humanity could be. While the bad guy will sink and devolve into the worst aspects of humanity. Archetypal, sure, but still worth noting. The only difference with the two archetypes is how that works within your story. But exploring humanity through the action lens leads to something compelling. It's looking at who we are underneath when the surface is chaos. But you can also take a different way, a pure study of humanity. What happens when the rules of the world break down? Something happens and the standard rules and laws go out the window. In this case, there is no one bad guy. The bad guy is the catastrophe. Or, deeper still, the bad guy is what humanity becomes. Will characters rise, like Alan Grant does in Jurassic Park, and become protectors? Or will they devolve, become selfish, or even violent? The answers to these questions depend largely on your story. They depend on the narrative you choose and the characters you create. Perhaps the flaw one needs to overcome is fear, cowardice that manifests as not acting at first, but then they step up. I can't tell you what the story holds. Only you can do that. All I can do is give you the tools that you need, knowledge of what's in store when you choose the genre. Just remember, action is usually faster than adventure, but together they make one wild ride. Thank you so much for tuning in, and until next time, fellow alchemists, take care.